All right, it's been a little while since I've done a Gen X video, so I'm going to tear into this since there's a lot of Gen Xers that are coming out of the woodwork all over TikTok and I'm sure other parts of the internet too, but TikTok is where I've seen it most prevalent. Well, let's talk about this because everybody keeps asking like, well, what exactly is Gen X going to do? All right, that's a fair question. So let's do some history first. This is going to be kind of boring, but let's do a little bit of history. Why is there such animosity that we're seeing towards boomers? Now, I think I covered this a long time ago, but I think I'm going to dust it off a little bit, and we're going to be a little more specific. Boomers are born between 1946 and 1964. That's that generation birth. So there's 18 years of span there. Here was what kind of happened. This is sort of after World War II. You had a huge amount of European immigration, but you also had this massive explosion in births. What that did was that by the time 1964 rolled around, the baby boomers were starting to rival the voting power of the so-called greatest generation, your World War II gen guys. And definitely by the 70s, by the mid to late 70s, the boomers had really started outvoting them, outvoting their parents on almost everything. The 1961 birth year, which is the peak, it's something like 40 or 50,000 per day, if I remember right, of births, that's a ton, that's a lot of births. And that's just in the US, okay? So we're not talking about Europe, we're talking about just in the US. Again, I'm talking mostly to Americans, although this applies to Aussies, it applies to all of our friends all over, the Western world, okay? Well, so you cut to about 1985, how old is the biggest generation of boomers? About 24 years old, for real. So they're in their mid to early 20s, you want to call it that. So you have this huge block of voters, and they then have been able to outvote their kids too. So you had a generation of people that were able to literally outvote their parents on almost everything. Then they've been able to successfully outvote Gen X, Millennials, and Zoomers. And the only thing that really unites a lot of the other generations is their hatred of boomers. And to some of you boomers out there, because I know I have a lot of boomer followers that quietly follow my work, but the reason why there's such animosity is because of this, is because you've got three generations of people now that the only way they will be able to function and be able to be self-directing, right, is if they all band together, and even then they may still not have the numbers to outvote boomers, even to this day. That's how bad it's gotten. So you have three generations of people that are at the mercy of a bunch of rapacious boomers that have completely lost touch with all reality. That a good chunk of them. I mean, I realize that there's probably 20%, hashtag not all boomers. I get that. But you have this huge number that has been outvoting their parents and their kids and their grandkids now. And they get whatever they want, right? And the politicians know this. The bankers and politicians know this shit. That's why they don't really care what anybody else wants. So, to the question of like, what exactly are Gen Xers going to do? Well, I mean, there's not a lot that we can do at the ballot box. So when you make a peaceful revolution impossible, you make a violent revolution inevitable. You understand? That's not me saying that, by the way. That's John F. fucking Kennedy, Mr. Boomer himself. Okay, actually he was World War II, but you get my point. Okay, the revered president. That's not me who said that. That's John F. Kennedy said that. Okay, Mr. Liberal, Mr. Leftist, or whatever you want to call him. Okay, this is a reality, though, right? This is why you don't do shit like this. This is why I keep telling boomers, take the L. Stop demanding $400 million a square fucking inch for your property. Start being realistic about it. Because, see, how do you know the difference between Gen Xers and boomers, right? Somebody asked me this a while back. They're like, oh, how do I know that, what's the difference? What's the primary difference between Gen X and boomers? Like, well, okay. if you ask a boomer what their childhood was like, right? Ask a boomer what was your childhood like? What was it like growing up in back in in the day when you were in high school? They're like, oh man, all right, all right, all right. It was super awesome, man. I worked at a car wash, bought a Camaro, drove to school, went off campus for lunch, did kind of whatever I want. And on Fridays and Saturdays we'd get a bunch of beer and go to the quarry and drink, like, right? And then when I got out of high school, I went to work at a local plant and bought my first house at 22, right? For $58,000. If you ask a Gen Xer what their childhood was like, their response is going to be something probably akin to this, like, well, we were kind of ignored for the large part because our parents were too busy drinking beer at the quarry. So, we kind of raised ourselves in a lot of cases. The 90s had really cool music, and the country wasn't as fucked up as it is now. It really sucks for the next generation. That's kind of how a lot of Gen Xers are going to respond. So you see the contrast. One is for them this awesome experience that they had. For most of Gen X, I'd say a good fair few. Okay, so I don't want to say a majority, but definitely a plurality of Gen X. For them, it wasn't exactly a fun time, and for them, when they were actually able to there was a video, dude did he talk about they're messing with our stasis. Yeah, what he's talking about is equilibrium, because for a lot of Xers, it took a lot of years to just to get stabilized in this economy, right? And not rich, just stabilized, just to where they can somewhat afford to function. Because I don't know too many boomers or too many Gen Xers that made big piles of money, right? I mean, they're out there. Again, I'm not saying not, like some people did, but a good chunk did not, right? Probably 80, 90% plus, are just kind of hanging on. And that's the difference. So, what is Gen X going to do? And what can Gen X do? Well, the biggest one is this, and this is something this is for millennials. You need to understand, because millennials are a larger generation. But you're going to have to understand something. Gen Xers have something that's very important, and it's called experience. They have a lot of experience, and that experience is valuable. You have to understand that. It really, truly is valuable. It's one of the reasons why I started doing this. This has nothing to do with me just talking to a camera to get clicks and likes. I do this, the financial side, I do a lot of this because most people have been employees their whole lives. They've never owned businesses. They don't understand why all this shit is happening. People who've been in business for a long time, they saw this coming 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they saw this coming. Why? Because they knew where the inevitable outcome was going for. The inevitable outcome was going to. They knew where that was going. And they knew that because, come on, go away. They knew that because they saw what was happening in their businesses, and they also can do the math and realize there is no financial way that most of these companies that are doing all of this shit, all these mega companies, cannot continue like this. They can't. Not without effectively having all kinds of subsidies, and not without effectively destroying the market, right? And that's what's happened, which is why this isn't a big shock to guys who've been doing this a long time. Like all of this bedlam you're seeing, this isn't a big surprise. So, what they can do is bring a lot of wisdom to the table. Wisdom comes from time and experience. That's it. That's the only place you get wisdom. And most of Gen X has a lot more of that, only because a lot of us had to figure this stuff out on our own. Right, we didn't really have, remember, a lot of our parents were still busy smoking, drinking, buying boats and jet skis and shit like that, right? Because, again, I've said this before, I grew up in the poor side of town. And even on the poor side of town, the boomers owned houses and boats and shit, okay? And had plenty of money to buy beer and cigarettes and, come on. And new cars and new projects and ride dirt bikes and all that kind of shit. And this was the poor side of town, okay? And I don't mean like relative poverty. I mean like for real. These people really probably didn't have the money to be doing any of that shit. Yet they did it anyway. They had plenty of money to do it. So that wisdom is what a lot of us can impart. And we can also help to work together and stuff and understand that a lot of these people gotta fucking go. So,